Hey, Washington Street. I'm Will Clark. I did one of these Devos about a month and a half ago, and Mr. Andy Lyon texted me a few weeks ago and asked if I'd be willing to do another one, so here I am. I'm going to be honest with you. These past couple of weeks have been really tough. See, as a white guy, I struggle to understand the hurt that so many people in our country are feeling right now. Let me be clear, though. It's not that I'm confused on why they're hurting. It's that I'll never be able to fully understand what that hurt means. And that's really hard because I want so badly to be able to empathize with people. I want to be able to help people through this. But I have no background or experience in what the answer is. So for the past week, I've been looking around and struggling to understand what my response should be. Struggling to find a way to reach out to my brothers and sisters who don't look like me without being weird. Struggling to enjoy the things that I'm doing now because I know there's a battle going on outside our doors. Now this battle, despite what the media or social media or the news is trying to tell you, this is not at the root of it a battle between groups of people. This is a battle between good and evil. And what the enemy wants us to do, what his goal is he wants to dilute the words of Jesus when he says love your neighbor. He wants to add a contraction. He wants to add the word but to the end of that. Love your neighbor but. He wants to add unless to the end of that. Love your neighbor unless. See, looking at the news and social media, I think we've forgotten the lack of a word at the end of Jesus' words. We look around and conclude that what Jesus really meant was love your neighbor, but if they do something wrong, ridicule them and you don't have to love them. Love your neighbor unless they look differently than you. Love your neighbor, but if they have different political views, they don't deserve love. See, we like this because it keeps us comfortable, but those aren't Jesus' words. I want to tell a story I heard last week. In Dallas, there was a woman going to the grocery store by herself. She was a mother. She had kids at home. Had to go get groceries. On her way, some rioters stopped her, beat her, took her car, her purse, her phone, and left her there on the side of the road. Now, I want to clarify, these rioters were not a part of the legitimate protests going on. These were not people seeking justice for George Floyd or for any people group. These were people looking out for themselves, looking to make a quick buck, looking to find something, looking to take whatever they could in the midst of all this chaos. Unfortunately for the woman, because she didn't have her phone, she had no way of contacting anybody. By chance, though, a man who lived a couple of doors down from her was driving by after all this happened. And he saw her, but he was in a suit. He really didn't want to get dirty, and decided that there had to be somebody else come by to help her out. Well, coming from the other direction is one of the ladies she goes to church with. But this lady saw her and remembered that her own kids were at home unsupervised, and she needed to get to the grocery store and pick up some stuff and then get back as quick as she could. And just as this woman was about to give up, the Black Lives Matter protest came around the corner, and they were walking down the street. And one of the men saw her and ran to her side. He took his phone out, called 911, rode the ambulance with her to the hospital. And when they got in the hospital, the woman was kind of coming in and out. So she couldn't give any information on who she was, on anybody to call, on a phone number, she had no way to pay, no insurance with her. And so the man told the nurses in the emergency room, he said, "Don't worry about it. Here's my card. I'll cover whatever. And if you get it figured out, you get it figured out. But if not, I'll cover it." Now, I want to ask you a question. Who was the neighbor to this woman? I know this story probably sounds extremely familiar. It's not because you've seen it in the news, unless something has happened in the past day that I don't know about. No, it sounds familiar because this is the parable of the Good Samaritan. I just kind of changed it up so it would fit our worldview. See, what happens over time is these parables kind of start to lose their meaning. Because the Good Samaritan is so widespread, so many people know about this story, that to be called a Good Samaritan is a compliment. I would love to be called a Good Samaritan. See, but at the time, the audience Jesus was speaking to despised the Samaritans. They thought the Samaritans were worthless, dirty, gross. And so in this story, it was shocking to the people listening that a Samaritan of all people would stop and help out. But when Jesus tells this parable, he asks quite frankly at the end, who was the neighbor to this man? And there's no answer but the Samaritan. See, the more I've listened and searched for answers during this time, I keep coming back to the thought of just being a neighbor. See, there's no doubt to me that all of this is an attack from the enemy. And I look to Scripture and look at other attacks, and one of them sticks out to me, and that's the attack in Genesis 3. So Adam and Eve are in the garden, and I'm assuming they're getting hungry, and the serpent sees a prime time to attack. And he asks Eve, says, "Hey, why don't you go eat from that tree?" And Eve responds with the command that God had given them. You're not to eat from the fruit of that tree. You're not supposed to touch it, or you'll surely die. But Satan, like he's doing now, dilutes those words, makes them all fuzzy. And he says, hold on. You're not surely going to die. Like, don't eat this. But, see, in verse 4, it says, "But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be truly opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." We obviously know what happens in this story, right? Adam and Eve eat the fruit, and then they hide from God because they're ashamed of what they did. And when God comes, God meets them in the garden, and he's got a response. And first, he responds to the serpent. And he gives a prophecy to the serpent, and he finishes with this. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. 2,000 years ago, we saw this play out. As Jesus hung on the cross, I know Satan sat there, kicked back in his chair, and thought, I did it. I won. But what we know is that was just the strike to the heel. Because 3 days later, when Jesus rose again, that was the head crush. I heard a preacher say once that sacrificial love is God's answer for every attack of the enemy. And I think he's right. I think now more than ever, we need to love. And I think we all know love is the answer, but we start to make it complicated for ourselves because we ask the question, well, who do I love? But Jesus made this really simple. He said, your neighbor. Who's my neighbor though? Everyone.